on them in the distribution. Pesticide use, you use pesticides, it kills butterflies and other insects. And finally, a couple of human uses, because people do raise them, and I just wanted to touch on it. So, before I did that though, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the fact that you can't just walk out for a season and look at all the butterflies and say, gee, there's less butterflies, I think, than used to be here and everything. You need to actually keep track of it and keep records of it. And I threw out these two butterfly species. They're okay? Is everything sharp enough? Okay. And I'll start with the satire comet in the bottom. Considered normally rare to extremely rare in most of Ontario. In 30 years in the Ottawa area, I saw 2 of them. And last year, I saw 5 of them. So there's a small fluctuation number, but why? Nobody had an answer. Other butterfly observers in Ottawa also saw more of this particular species. Now, but I will touch on even more so, the one up in the left-hand corner. This is a classical story about the fluctuating numbers butterfly. It's the hickory hair streak. And over my sort of 50 years of looking at this butterflies on and off, I love the hair streaks. They're the little beautiful guys with this nice little patterning at the bottom. The hickory was always a mystery. The hickory hair streak, in most years, you see 1, maybe 2. I know in the Toronto area, you may not even get that many, I'm not sure. But every now and then, they would go boom, and you'd suddenly have thousands of them everywhere. The classic example of that is a friend of mine had a net, and he was out doing a little collecting in the Tweed area in Ontario, and there was a flowering basswood in the back of this garden he was in, and you look up and you see all these little things flying around up there, and he said there was hundreds of little butterflies. He assumed they were probably hair streaks that he couldn't get. So he got his net out, and he took one sweep, took it down and counted it. He had 29 hickory hair streaks in that net in one sweep. Those kind of numbers are just phenomenal. And if you think about that's all over eastern North America, they suddenly go blam. And then the next year, I didn't see one. So you can't judge a butterfly status by 1 year, 2 years, 2 years. You need to keep the data going for years and years and years, as the Toronto Entomologists Association is, and I highly commend them for that activity. So touch on natural losses. Said most butterflies, as an adult, don't live that long. And here we have a little skipper on the left. It's been on the wing probably a couple of weeks. Most butterflies last a couple of weeks on the wing. There are other life cycles the rest of the year. But this particular one, look how warm. It was so warm. Even to this day, I have no idea what that species is, even though I was that far from it. But its time is probably going to be up soon. So it got a whole bunch of conditions that wore it down. And a lot of it, they get very aggressive, and these little skippers attack each other, and they quickly beat each other up, being very territorial. Butterflies are territorial. But the one on the right, this is an interesting story, because this poor Canadian tiger swallowtail, one of the bigger, beautiful butterflies, if you look very carefully at that picture, you can see just under the flower head, there's a little crab spider. The crab spider is locked onto this thing that's probably 3-4 times as big as its body mass, and it's slowly sipping the juices out of it. But if you also look at this thing, and you look at the lower right-hand part of the wings on the picture there, you'll see there's a great jagged piece out of it with a rip underneath it. Clearly a bird came up to it and went chunk. The butterfly simply ripped away, the bird got away with the wing, the butterfly was fine. It kept going long enough to get caught by the crab spider, and let's hope it had a chance to reproduce on the way before it finally succumbed. And one must talk about weather systems, everything from frost to monster storms take out a lot of butterflies. That's just what happens, okay? They get swept out by the rains or the ice, and they're gone. So those are natural losses. That's the last we'll talk about that. What I want to talk about are those human-influenced factors. And the first one, and by far the biggest one, is the habitat loss. There's no question about it that as we lose habitat, we lose butterflies. And I use as my example here the hackberry emperor that you see at the bottom. And this is a picture of one that I took up in the locale on the upper left there, which is the skunk's misery. Have a number of you folks been down looking at butterflies and skunk's misery by any chance? There's one at least, 2 and 1 in the back. Well, you're probably wondering how it got the name. Go look for butterflies in skunk's misery in about June, and you'll know very quickly there are monstrous masses of mosquitoes in this place. It's a nice, wet Carolinian forest. But you'll see, it's one road goes through, and next thing you know, clearing from the road, cords being planted, and what you end up with, if you look at the map on the right there, those tiny little dots represent existing Carolinian forest. This is off Carolinian Canada's website. So you got these tiny little isolated spots where there's hackberry trees that this thing feeds on as a larvae. You could find it, but how big do those little patches have to be before butterflies like this disappear? We don't really have an answer to that yet. And it could happen that over time, as Carolinian forest disappears, the hackberry butterfly will disappear. And I wanted to touch on grasslands, the most endangered ecosystem in Canada, and especially the long grass prairies that you have mainly out in prairie regions, so southern Manitoba, Saskatchewan, down into the US is the heartland of grasslands. But we have some nice grassland here in Ontario. The photo on the left is the Jiwa Prairie down near Windsor. And there's some nice big chunks of grassland. And one of the butterflies that has occasionally in the past been found there is this beautiful regal fritillary. The regal fritillary is considered the most beautiful fritillary in North America. It is a pure grassland species found feeding as a larvae on some food plants, violets, that exist in those areas. And it's basically disappeared from just about everywhere. It's now an endangered species in Canada. It's more than an endangered species in the US, and there's less than 2% of its native habitat left. So grasslands go, regal fritillary disappears. Now, you don't have to entirely destroy a habitat in order to make it not user-friendly for butterflies. And the example I chose here is a little dusky wing called the mottled dusky wing, which was always kind of rare, and I'll speak about Ontario, in Canada, in Ontario, and a few locations in southern Manitoba. And the mottled dusky wing has been slowly disappearing. Jessica Greeley, who's here today, did a wonderful report that has been sent to Kasuik for them to consider how to declare the species as at some level of risk. Because it is, and I'm firmly convinced it will disappear if we don't do something about it. And what is the something? All those little kind of marks you see, the little triangles and the circles and the squares and everything, represent where it had been recorded in Ontario. In Jessica's go around, I think she found it in just the ones with the blackened circles and the blackened square. And I hate to tell you, Jessica, but I haven't seen one in that blackened square near Ottawa since I saw that last one in 2009. So it's probably gone. There were 2 known locations where I live where when people said, I'd love to see a mottled dusky wing in May, let's go. If I can find them, 1, 2, a dozen, whatever. I haven't seen one in either of those locations for 3 years and in one place for almost 15 years. Why? Okay, why? It feeds on a particular small shrub called New Jersey tea, Ceanothus species, a plant. And the New Jersey tea is the only thing it's found on, and it likes to grow in these open, sandy, limestoney alvar areas. And the picture at the bottom is a picture of the Burtlands alvar near Ottawa. I went out and visited with Jessica, and you can see the damage in the forefront from all-terrain vehicles whipping around. Well, it may not be evident, but if there had been any New Jersey tea plants there, they're not going to survive that kind of abuse. And they're not. They're just fewer and fewer and fewer of the plants. It's also due, I think, to overgrowth by other kinds of vegetation that blocks these out. But here's a butterfly that needs protection, so I hope Jessica's report gets the kind of attention it deserves. And all we're doing is modeling it. This is now a provincial park, so it's protected, but so what if the food plant's not there and the butterfly's not there? So I want to talk a bit about invasive species. I call this the story of the 2 whites. Some of you are, I'm sure, familiar with this. The mustard white on the left-hand side, that's a picture I took in my backyard in Ottawa, was a very widespread and relatively common butterfly throughout into the 19th century. If you read some of the early butterfly reports and everything, you'll see that they say mustard whites is a species of woodland clearings, roadside meadows and fields. You don't see it there anymore. Why? Well, one of the theories is that this other butterfly on the right, the good old cabbage white, which I saw as a little kid and got me into butterflies, good for it, but it also is a major invasive. And it came into Quebec City in about 1860. We actually know that. It was recorded there. And it then has spread since to become probably the 2nd most abundant butterfly in North America. And it feeds on a lot of the same plants that the mustard white does, mustard family of plants. And one of the theories is that this thing has just pushed the mustard white out of its open habitats and it's retreated back into woodlands. It makes sense. One would have to document that fairly carefully to be absolutely sure. I'm going to look at a couple of other invasive butterfly species. The one on the left there, I mentioned the cabbage white was the 2nd most abundant. This is the single most abundant butterfly in North America, called the European skipper. It's an invasive, and it only showed up for the first time in 1910 in the London area in Canada, and it's now gone right across the province. The province and right across the continent, to the point where I can take you out into a field of timothy grass, which is the grass you grow for hay, mainly. That's what it likes to feed on. It probably came in on bales of timothy grass from England as an egg or a pupa or something, and then hatched out, and boy, it found itself with lots of timothy grass, and away it went. You can see thousands of these in the field now. So very, very common, but it wasn't tracked over the years because it just wasn't that many people like us who were out there tracking these things to see where they went. We now have a new golden opportunity for a second invasive species, and that's the little blue on the right. I had an email from a fellow who worked at Mirabel Airport, and at his lunchtimes he liked to go out and observe and photograph butterflies, and he found this thing about 5 years ago and wasn't sure what it was. He looked it up in his butterfly books, and he said it looks kind of like a cardinal blue, but that wouldn't be possible, would it? No, the cardinal blue is extinguished, so, and no evidence, it wasn't its right habitat or anything. And I kind of looked at the picture and I went, this is familiar. And I walked it in, a picture of it, to my colleague, who's the curator of the National Insect Collection. We put the thing in front of us, we both looked at each other and went, no wonder it's not in the North American butterfly books, it's a European species called common blue. First record for North America. Since then, a bunch of us have gone down and we've done some survey, and the University of Ottawa is doing a survey of the species and tracking it spreading out. It's now found in about a 20-kilometer triangle around Mirabel. Last year it actually showed up in Oka, in sight of the Ottawa River, so a year or two it's going to become an Ontario species. So you TEA folks better pay attention to that, because you're going to have to think about it. And I'll bet you could bet money this thing will show up in the Toronto region. The only question is when. Is it going to take 5 years, 10 years? It's likely to go east faster because of prevailing winds, but it's also moving west from Mirabel, so there's nothing to stop it from showing up. So look out for this lovely big blue butterfly with the big orange spots on the bottom side. And I'd really like to hear when somebody actually sees one. It isn't just butterflies that are showing up out of the blue in North America. We're also getting invasive plant species, and most of them, they are agricultural pests, and they're not necessarily things we want here, but not many of them we understand seem to be affecting butterfly populations. But there is one, I pointed out here, and that's the West Virginia white, which is considered an uncommon, rare beast. It used to be an endangered species in Ontario. It was taken off the list because they found subsequent populations of it they didn't know existed. But it's still isolated to woodlands where its food plant, a thing called dentaria, toothwort, grows. But in the US, in the last number of years, people have been discovering females of this species laying eggs on the invasive plant on the left, called garlic mustard. Any gardeners in the crowd will know about garlic mustard. You're going to have them in your backyard, and they're going to everybody's backyard. It's a really, really invasive weed. The females lay the eggs, but they don't survive. So what's going to happen to this species that depends on a particular plant, and the female suddenly says, well, this plant's equally good, so she lays half her eggs on it. That creates half of the opportunity for this thing to breed successfully. And as garlic mustard replaces other things, is there a possibility it might just squeeze out the West Virginia one? It's entirely possible. But that's the negative story. That's the bad story. On the other hand, some invasive create an opportunity for butterflies. And a lot of what I researched didn't just say things are bad for butterflies. A lot of things said for certain species it's getting better. And the little butterfly on the left there, Henry's elfin, which I think is a rarity here in the Toronto region, but we used to consider rare and local in the Ottawa area. I knew where to go. You go to certain woodlands where the food plant of larvae was found, and you'd find it. But lo and behold, one of my colleagues saw a female laying eggs on the plant on the right, the glossy buckthorn, which is another hugely invasive plant that's moving right across North America. And it's a big shrub thing, and it blocks out other shrubs. And what's happened is somehow the Henry's elfin has found it can lay eggs that will survive on this plant, and now that butterfly we consider more